Andrew Holt had always dreamed of escaping the chaos of city life and settling into a quiet suburban home, where he could focus on building his future without unnecessary distractions. At 38, he was finally making that dream a reality. His new house, situated at the edge of a tranquil neighborhood, was everything he could have hoped for: a spacious backyard, a well-maintained interior, and most importantly, complete energy independence. The property came equipped with a state-of-the-art solar energy system and a backup generator, making Andrew's home not only eco-friendly but also entirely self-reliant. It was a key selling point that had sealed the deal when he first saw the house. For Andrew, who prided himself on efficiency and planning, the idea of being off the grid in his own small way was deeply satisfying. The neighborhood itself appeared idyllic. Rows of manicured lawns stretched as far as the eye could see, and the streets were lined with flowering trees that cast pleasant shadows on the pavement. Neighbors waved from their porches as Andrew unloaded boxes from his truck on moving day, offering polite smiles and brief greetings. It all seemed perfect until Karen Jennings introduced herself. She appeared at Andrew's front door, just as he was carrying in the last of his boxes, a meticulously dressed woman in her 50s with a bright smile that somehow felt both warm and calculated. Her demeanor suggested she was the type of person who always managed to know what was happening on every street, in every home. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she exclaimed, holding a neatly wrapped basket of muffins. Andrew, caught off guard but appreciative, set his box down and extended a hand. Karen shook it firmly, her smile unwavering. "I'm Karen Jennings," she said. "I live just over there." She gestured vaguely toward the left, where her two-story house stood with its perfectly trimmed hedges and overly elaborate lawn decorations. Andrew thanked her for the muffins and introduced himself, noting her sharp gaze as it flitted to the solar panels on his roof. "Ah," she said, nodding toward the array of panels. "So you're the one who bought the Johnson place. I heard they were selling to someone new." She tilted her head slightly. The Johnsons were good neighbors, very considerate. They always helped out when we needed a bit of extra power, especially during those summer heat waves. We've got a big freezer in the garage, and you know how expensive electricity can get. Andrew felt a subtle chill despite her warm tone. Her words seemed like a veiled suggestion, but he decided to play dumb. "I'm still getting everything set up," he said casually. "The panels are great, though. They should cover all my needs." Karen's smile tightened just slightly. "Of course," she said. "But, this neighborhood has always been about helping each other out. We're a community here, Andrew. People look out for one another." Andrew nodded politely but felt a knot forming in his stomach. He wasn't interested in sharing his energy resources, especially not with someone he'd just met. Still, he didn't want to start off on the wrong foot. "I'll keep that in mind," he said, hoping the conversation would end there. Karen lingered for a moment longer, her eyes scanning his yard as if taking inventory. Finally, she handed him the basket and added, "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask. And, well, I'm sure we'll chat again soon." Andrew watched her walk away, her gait confident, as though she'd already claimed a small piece of his new life. He shook off the uneasy feeling and returned to unpacking, telling himself that she was probably just being neighborly. But over the next few days, Karen's presence became impossible to ignore. She seemed to materialize whenever Andrew was outside, whether he was watering the lawn, adjusting the solar system, or simply relaxing on the porch. She always had a reason to stop by: a question about his plans for the property, a comment about the weather, or a suggestion about how things were usually done in the neighborhood. What unsettled Andrew most was her apparent fixation on his solar panels. She asked endless questions about their capacity, efficiency, and whether he had backup storage. "It's just so impressive," she said one afternoon, shading her eyes as she looked up at the roof. "I mean, it must produce more power than you could ever use in one house, right?" Andrew kept his answers vague, sensing that her interest wasn't purely out of curiosity. "It works well for me," he said simply, hoping to discourage further probing. Karen, however, wasn't easily dissuaded. She continued, "the Johnsons used to let a few of us neighbors tap into their system during outages. Just for emergencies, of course. It really brought us all together." Andrew felt his patience wearing thin but maintained his composure. "I'll keep that in mind," he said again, his tone firmer this time. Karen seemed to catch the subtle edge in his voice and gave him a tight-lipped smile before walking away. Despite her attempts to mask it, Karen's frustration was becoming evident. Andrew began to notice subtle signs of her discontent: trash bins mysteriously overturned in his driveway, dead leaves swept onto his porch, and long, lingering stares from her windows as he worked in his yard. He chose to ignore it, focusing instead on settling into his new home and enjoying the peace and quiet he'd worked so hard to achieve. But Karen wasn't one to be ignored. One evening, as Andrew was finishing dinner, he noticed something odd outside. A faint light flickered near the edge of his yard, close to the boundary he shared with Karen's property. He stepped outside to investigate and found a bundle of wires snaking through the grass, partially hidden beneath the leaves. Following the trail, his suspicions were confirmed. The wires led straight to Karen's house. She had tapped into his solar system. Andrew's initial reaction was disbelief. He crouched down, inspecting the crude setup. The connection was sloppy but functional, clearly designed to siphon power without being noticed. Anger bubbled up as he realized the audacity of what she'd done. He immediately severed the connection, rolling up the wires and throwing them onto her side of the property line. He returned to his house, his mind racing with questions. How long had this been going on? Did she expect him not to notice? And most importantly, what would she do next? The answer came the following morning when Karen appeared at his door, her expression a mask of feigned concern. "Good morning, Andrew," she said sweetly, though her eyes flashed with irritation. "I noticed you did some work on the electrical lines last night. I hope you're not planning to disrupt the neighborhood's harmony." Andrew folded his arms and met her gaze. "Karen, I think we need to have a serious conversation about boundaries." The morning after Andrew discovered Karen's illegal electrical connection, he sat on his porch with a mug of coffee, trying to collect his thoughts. The faint trail of wires leading from his solar system to her property had been an unpleasant revelation, but her audacity in directly siphoning his electricity was almost surreal. Andrew had already cut the connection and rolled the cables back in her yard, but he knew the problem wasn't over. Someone like Karen wouldn't simply shrug and let it go. He wasn't wrong. Just as he took another sip of coffee, Karen appeared. She walked briskly across her lawn, her steps unusually heavy for someone trying to appear calm. Her ever-present smile was absent this time, replaced with a sharp, tight-lipped expression that made her intentions unmistakable. She didn't wait for Andrew to speak. "Good morning, Andrew," she said, her voice laced with forced politeness. "I noticed you've been tampering with the electrical system." Andrew raised an eyebrow. "Tampering?" he asked coolly. "Karen, I disconnected your illegal setup. You were stealing electricity from my system. That's not tampering, it's protecting my property." Karen's eyes narrowed, but she didn't miss a beat. "Stealing? That's a bit dramatic, don't you think? I was simply using what had been offered to the community for years." "The Johnsons." "The Johnsons are gone," Andrew interrupted, his patience already thin. "And even if they allowed it, that doesn't mean you can tap into my system without asking. That's theft, plain and simple." Karen placed a hand on her hip, her voice turning icy. "I think you're misunderstanding the situation, Andrew. This neighborhood has always operated on trust and mutual support. The Johnsons understood that, and so did everyone else. You, on the other hand, seem determined to isolate yourself. That's not how things work here." Andrew took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "Karen, I understand that you may have had some sort of agreement with the previous owners, but I'm not the Johnsons. This is my home, my system, and I've made it clear that I'm not sharing it. End of discussion." For a moment, Karen seemed taken aback by his firmness, but she quickly recovered. Her lips curled into a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I see," she said slowly. "Well, I suppose we'll have to see what the neighborhood thinks about your interpretation of community spirit." Without another word, she turned and walked back to her house, leaving Andrew to wonder what she meant. The uneasy feeling in his gut only grew stronger as the day went on. That afternoon, Andrew decided to take more proactive steps to protect his system. He called a local electrician and asked for a full inspection of his property to ensure no other unauthorized connections had been made. When the electrician arrived and began examining the solar panels and the generator, Andrew felt a twinge of relief, confident that this would put an end to the issue. However, what the electrician found only added to his concerns. "Looks like this isn't the first time someone's tapped into your system," the electrician said, holding up a bundle of aged, frayed cables. "These are old lines, probably installed years ago. They lead toward your neighbor's properties. My guess is that someone's been piggybacking off this system long before you moved in." Andrew frowned, his frustration mounting. "Can you disconnect all of it? I don't want anyone accessing my energy without permission." The electrician nodded and got to work, carefully removing the old lines and sealing off any potential access points. By the time he finished, Andrew's system was fully secured, but the discovery of the older connections left him uneasy. It wasn't just Karen, this seemed to be a pattern in the neighborhood. He wondered how many other homes had benefited from this setup without his knowledge. The idea that his property had been treated as a shared resource for so long made him feel both violated and angry. The next morning, the repercussions of his actions became clear. As Andrew stepped outside to grab the newspaper, he noticed a group of neighbors gathered in Karen's driveway, talking animatedly. The moment they spotted him, the conversation stopped, and several of them shot him cold looks. Karen stood at the center of the group, her arms crossed and a smug expression on her face. Andrew didn't need to hear what they were saying to know he was the topic of discussion. By the time he returned to his house, Karen was already on her way over, her steps slow and deliberate. She carried a clipboard this time, which immediately set off alarm bells in Andrew's mind. He opened the door before she could knock. "Karen," he said, his tone guarded. "What now?" She held up the clipboard, as if it were a badge of authority. "I thought it would be best to formalize things, given your reluctance to cooperate. This is a petition, signed by several of your neighbors, stating that they believe the electricity generated by your system should be considered a shared resource, as it has been for years." Andrew stared at her, incredulous. "You're joking, right?" "I'm completely serious," Karen replied, her voice calm but with a dangerous undertone. "This neighborhood thrives on mutual support. Your refusal to participate is not only selfish but also disruptive. If you continue to act this way, you'll find yourself very unpopular around here." Andrew's jaw tightened as he struggled to keep his composure. "Karen, I don't care about popularity contests. What you've done is illegal. I've already secured my system and documented the unauthorized connections. If you or anyone else tries to access it again, I won't hesitate to involve the authorities." Karen's eyes flashed with anger, but she didn't back down. "You think you can threaten me? Let me remind you, Andrew, that you're the outsider here. I've lived in this neighborhood for over 20 years. People trust me. They listen to me. Do you really think they'll side with you over me?" Andrew felt his frustration boiling over. "I don't need anyone to side with me. I just need you to stay off my property and leave my system alone." Karen's smile returned, but this time it was laced with venom. "We'll see about that," she said, turning on her heel and walking away. Over the next few days, Andrew began to notice subtle acts of hostility from his neighbors. Trash cans were knocked over in his driveway. His mailbox was stuffed with flyers for lawn care services he hadn't requested. At night, his motion-activated lights flickered more often than usual, as if someone was deliberately triggering them. It was clear that Karen's influence was spreading. Andrew decided it was time to take a stand. He contacted an attorney to discuss his options, ensuring that he had legal protection against any further interference. He also installed additional security measures, including cameras and reinforced locks on his energy system. If Karen or anyone else tried to mess with his property again, he would have undeniable proof. But Karen wasn't done. One morning, Andrew woke up to find a handwritten note pinned to his front door. The message was brief but chilling. "You don't belong here. This isn't over." Andrew had known that moving to a new neighborhood could bring its share of challenges, but he never imagined things escalating so quickly. Karen's note, short, ominous, and unsettling, confirmed what he'd feared. She wasn't going to let the matter rest. For a moment, as he stood in his doorway holding the scrap of paper, Andrew considered ignoring it. Perhaps it was just another intimidation tactic, but deep down, he knew this wasn't the kind of problem that would resolve itself. Karen was a determined woman, and her sense of entitlement seemed boundless. Deciding not to let her threats linger unchecked, Andrew placed the note into a plastic sleeve, preserving it as evidence. His attorney had already advised him to document everything, and he wasn't about to ignore that advice now. He wasn't entirely sure what Karen was planning next, but he had a sinking feeling it would be something bigger than a few passive-aggressive notes or overturned trash cans. Later that morning, Andrew noticed unusual activity across the street. Karen had gathered several neighbors in her front yard. Some held clipboards, others had folders or notepads, and a few were gesturing animatedly toward his property. Andrew kept his distance but couldn't ignore the pointed glances being thrown his way. He decided not to engage. Instead, he stayed inside and began reviewing his security footage from the past week. If Karen or her allies had been trespassing on his property again, he needed evidence. Sure enough, as he sifted through the footage, he found several instances of shadowy figures loitering near his backyard at night. Though the faces weren't clear, their actions were unmistakable. They were inspecting the area where the old electrical connections had been removed. The footage infuriated Andrew, but it also steeled his resolve. He wasn't going to let Karen bully him into submission. That evening, he upgraded his outdoor security system, installing higher-resolution cameras and motion-sensitive lights in strategic locations. He also reinforced the locks on his electrical boxes, ensuring they couldn't be tampered with again. It was a long, exhausting process, but by the time he finished, he felt a small measure of relief. He hoped the extra precautions would be enough to deter any further interference. The next morning, as Andrew was leaving for work, he noticed something strange. A city inspection notice had been posted on his front gate. The document claimed that his solar energy system was non-compliant with local regulations and that he was required to cease operations until further notice. Andrew's stomach sank. He'd spent months researching and installing the system to ensure it met every code and standard. This notice was nothing more than an attempt to harass him, and he had a good idea who was behind it. Determined to resolve the issue, Andrew immediately contacted the city inspector's office. After several frustrating hours of phone calls and bureaucratic runarounds, he finally managed to speak with someone who confirmed his suspicions. The complaint came from a neighbor, the official said, sounding slightly exasperated. "It's a routine check, but if your system is compliant, there's nothing to worry about." Andrew gritted his teeth. "It is compliant," he said firmly. "I've followed every regulation to the letter." "Then the inspection will reflect that," the official replied. "We'll send someone out to confirm." Though the response was technically reassuring, Andrew couldn't shake his frustration. Karen was clearly escalating her campaign against him, and now she was dragging city officials into the mess. He was tempted to confront her directly but decided against it. Any confrontation would likely play right into her hands, giving her more ammunition to paint him as the neighborhood troublemaker. The inspection took place 2 days later. The inspector, a tired-looking man in his 50s, spent over an hour scrutinizing every aspect of Andrew's system. He checked the wiring, the panel installation, and even the generator. By the end of the visit, the inspector shook his head. "Everything looks fine," he said. "Frankly, this complaint was a waste of time." Andrew felt a flicker of vindication, but it was short-lived. That same evening, Karen struck again. This time, she filed a formal complaint with the neighborhood association, claiming that Andrew's system was a safety hazard and posed a threat to the community. Though Andrew wasn't officially part of the association, his property was on the outskirts of its jurisdiction. Karen's influence extended far beyond official boundaries. The complaint quickly gained traction, with several of Karen's allies backing her claim. Andrew was summoned to a neighborhood meeting to address the allegations. The meeting took place in Karen's living room, which had been transformed into a makeshift courtroom. Andrew entered to find a dozen neighbors seated in a semicircle, their expressions ranging from skeptical to outright hostile. Karen sat at the head of the room, her clipboard in hand and an air of smug authority radiating from her. "Thank you for joining us, Andrew," she said sweetly, though her tone was anything but welcoming. "We're here to discuss some very serious concerns." Andrew crossed his arms and leaned against the wall. "Concerns that you fabricated," he said bluntly. Karen's smile didn't waver. "That's a strong accusation," she said. "But the fact remains that your system has caused disruptions to the neighborhood. Several residents have reported power surges and outages since you moved in. We need to ensure that your setup is safe and compliant." Andrew stared at her, incredulous. "Power surges, outages. That's ridiculous. My system is entirely independent. It doesn't affect the grid at all." One of the neighbors, an older man Andrew hadn't met before, spoke up. "If that's true, then why were there outages last week? My lights flickered 3 times in one evening." Andrew suppressed a groan. "I can't speak to what's happening with your power, but it has nothing to do with me. My system doesn't even connect to the neighborhood grid." Karen pounced on his words. "Then perhaps the issue is with your generator," she said. "Those things can be very unstable, you know." Andrew had had enough. "This is absurd," he said, his voice rising slightly. "Karen, you know exactly what's going on here. You're the one causing disruptions, not me. You've been stealing electricity from my system, and now that I've cut you off, you're trying to paint me as the problem." A murmur spread through the room, and Karen's expression darkened. "That's a very serious accusation, Andrew," she said coldly. "If you have evidence, I suggest you present it." "I do," Andrew shot back. "I have security footage showing the illegal connections on my property, and if you want to keep pushing this, I'm happy to involve the police." The room fell silent. For a moment, Karen seemed genuinely rattled, but she quickly recovered. "I see," she said, her voice tight. "Well, if you insist on being combative, I suppose we'll have to resolve this through the proper channels." Andrew didn't stay to hear the rest. He walked out of the meeting, his frustration boiling over. Karen's antics were relentless, and it was clear she wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted or until Andrew forced her to back down. It wasn't just about the electricity anymore. This was a battle for control, and Karen wasn't going to give it up easily. As Andrew stepped into the cool night air, he realized one thing with absolute certainty: the worst was yet to come. Andrew had barely made it through the chaotic neighborhood meeting at Karen's house without losing his composure. As he walked back to his property that evening, his mind raced with thoughts about what would come next. Karen had shown her hand. She wasn't just trying to intimidate him into compliance. She was actively working to turn the entire neighborhood against him. The accusations about power surges and outages were baseless, but that didn't matter if Karen convinced enough people to believe her. She was playing a game of perception, and Andrew realized that he needed to step up his efforts if he wanted to win. This wasn't just a disagreement over electricity anymore, it was war. The next morning, Andrew woke early to assess the damage, both literal and figurative, from the previous night. His security footage from the last week revealed more troubling activity near the edges of his property. While Karen's late-night sabotage attempts had been outright destructive, yet they were escalating. The footage showed her and 2 other neighbors standing near his generator enclosure late at night, seemingly discussing something. Though they hadn't entered his property, the proximity was enough to set Andrew on edge. He made a mental note to review the footage with his lawyer. If Karen wanted to keep escalating, he'd be ready. Determined to stay ahead of her schemes, Andrew decided to take proactive steps. First, he contacted the city inspector's office to request a formal report on his solar and backup systems. Though the initial inspection had cleared him, he wanted an official document confirming his compliance with all regulations. He also arranged for a private contractor to perform an independent audit of his system, ensuring there was no doubt about its safety or legality. Andrew knew Karen's next move would likely involve twisting the truth to cast doubt on his setup, and he needed to be prepared with evidence to counter her claims. But Karen wasn't waiting for Andrew to react. That afternoon, as Andrew was reviewing his system's logs, a loud knock echoed through his front door. He opened it to find 2 uniformed officers standing on his porch. Their presence was intimidating but measured, and one of them stepped forward to speak. "Mr. Holt," the officer began, "we've received a complaint from your neighbor, Ms. Jennings. She's claimed that your electrical system poses a safety risk to the neighborhood and that it may be the source of recent power fluctuations in the area." Andrew couldn't help but scoff. "Power fluctuations? My system doesn't even connect to the grid. It's self-contained." The officer nodded. "We understand, sir, but given the nature of the complaint, we're required to investigate. Can we inspect your setup?" Andrew considered his options. He could refuse and potentially escalate the situation, or he could comply and let the officers see for themselves that Karen's allegations were baseless. Deciding on the latter, he led the officers to his generator and solar panel systems, explaining how they worked as he went. After a thorough inspection, the officers appeared satisfied. "Everything looks fine," one of them said. "We'll note that in our report." "Thanks," Andrew replied, though his relief was tempered by frustration. Karen had managed to drag law enforcement into her vendetta, wasting their time and his. As the officers left, Andrew couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of her next wave of attacks. Later that day, Andrew received a call from his lawyer, Rachel. He filled her in on the latest developments, including the police visit. Rachel wasn't surprised. "This is classic harassment," she said. "She's trying to wear you down by creating as many small, annoying problems as possible. The good news is, these kinds of tactics usually backfire once you start pushing back." Andrew sighed. "I feel like I'm already pushing back, but she just keeps escalating. What's my next move?" Rachel's tone became serious. "You need to document everything, every complaint, every incident, every conversation. If she steps over the line legally, we'll have the evidence to take her to court. In the meantime, I'll draft a cease and desist letter outlining the legal consequences if she continues this behavior. It won't stop her entirely, but it might make her think twice." Grateful for Rachel's guidance, Andrew spent the rest of the evening reviewing his security footage again, carefully noting the dates and times of Karen's suspicious activity. The process was tedious but necessary. By the time he finished, he had a comprehensive timeline of events that painted a clear picture of Karen's campaign against him. The next week brought an unexpected development. While Andrew was inspecting his solar panels, he noticed something unusual, a faint scorch mark along one of the junction boxes. Alarmed, he called his contractor to investigate. The contractor arrived later that day and confirmed Andrew's worst fear. Someone had tampered with the panel, causing a small electrical short. Though the damage was minor, it could have been catastrophic if left unchecked. "This wasn't an accident," the contractor said grimly. "Someone messed with this deliberately. Do you have any idea who might have done it?" Andrew didn't hesitate. "I have a pretty good idea," he said, clenching his fists. Karen's vendetta was no longer just a nuisance, it was becoming dangerous. That evening, Andrew filed a police report about the sabotage. He provided the scorch mark as evidence, along with the contractor's assessment and a copy of his security footage. Though the footage didn't show anyone directly tampering with the panel, it captured Karen and her accomplices loitering near his property on the night of the incident. The police took his report seriously, promising to investigate further. For the first time, Andrew felt like he might finally be gaining some ground against Karen's relentless harassment. But Karen wasn't done yet. The following day, Andrew received a letter in the mail, another official-looking document, this time from a local mediation service. The letter stated that Karen had filed a request for a mediated resolution to the ongoing community dispute between her and Andrew. The mediation was scheduled for the end of the week, and Andrew was strongly encouraged to attend. Rachel wasn't impressed when Andrew showed her the letter. "This is just another tactic to waste your time," she said. "Mediation is non-binding, and you're under no obligation to agree to anything. But it might be worth attending just to show that you're willing to be reasonable. It'll reflect well on you if this ends up in court." Reluctantly, Andrew agreed. The mediation session was held in a small conference room at a community center. Karen arrived first, dressed in a conservative suit and carrying a thick folder of documents. Andrew arrived a few minutes later, accompanied by Rachel, whose calm, professional demeanor was a stark contrast to Karen's barely contained smugness. The mediator, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and an air of authority, began the session by outlining the rules. Both parties would have an opportunity to state their case, and the goal was to reach a mutually agreeable solution. Karen went first, launching into a long-winded tirade about how Andrew's selfishness was disrupting the neighborhood and endangering lives. She presented a series of fabricated complaints from neighbors, painting herself as the voice of reason trying to restore harmony. When it was Andrew's turn to speak, he remained calm and factual. He outlined the timeline of events, presented his security footage, and provided the contractor's report confirming the sabotage to his panel. Rachel supplemented his points with legal context, making it clear that Karen's behavior constituted harassment and that Andrew had every right to protect his property. The mediator listened carefully, but as the session progressed, it became clear that Karen wasn't interested in compromise. She dismissed Andrew's evidence as paranoia and accused him of attacking her character. Despite the mediator's best efforts, the session ended without resolution. As Andrew left the conference room, he felt a mixture of frustration and resolve. Karen had shown her true colors. She wasn't just a difficult neighbor. She was a master manipulator who thrived on conflict. But Andrew wasn't going to back down. He had the law on his side, and he was prepared to see this fight through to the end. For the first time since moving to the neighborhood, he felt a spark of hope. After the failed mediation, Andrew returned home feeling both frustrated and determined. Karen's performance during the session had been as manipulative as he expected, but her complete disregard for the evidence he'd presented was infuriating. Worse, she had left the meeting with a smug smile, as if she'd won some unseen victory. It was clear to Andrew that her campaign against him wasn't about to end, it was only going to escalate. The next morning, Andrew woke to a sharp sound outside his bedroom window. He sat up, listening intently, but the noise didn't come again. Dismissing it as an animal or an early morning delivery truck, he got up to start his day. When he stepped outside, however, his stomach sank. Strewn across his driveway was a pile of broken glass bottles shattered into jagged pieces, mixed with dirt and something sticky that reeked of chemicals. It wasn't an accident. Someone had dumped it there intentionally. Andrew carefully cleared the mess, but the act felt like a clear warning. Karen was taking her vendetta to a new level, and this time, she was leaving tangible evidence of her malice. He filed a police report, providing photos of the damage, but without direct proof tying Karen to the act. There wasn't much the officers could do. They promised to increase patrols in the area, but Andrew knew it wouldn't stop her. Determined not to let Karen intimidate him, Andrew spent the rest of the day strengthening his defenses. He installed additional security cameras along the perimeter of his property, ensuring that every angle was covered. He also added motion-sensitive floodlights to the back of the house, where the shadows of the tree line had provided too much cover for Karen's nighttime trespassing. By the time the sun set, he felt a little more secure, though the unease in his gut remained. The following evening, as Andrew reviewed the footage from his newly installed cameras, he found something chilling. At around 2 a.m., 3 figures appeared at the edge of his property, just beyond the boundary marked by his fence. Though the camera's infrared captured them clearly, their faces were obscured by hoods. One of them held what looked like a crowbar, while another carried a bucket. They lingered there for several minutes, gesturing toward Andrew's house and whispering among themselves before disappearing back into the woods. Andrew clenched his fists as he replayed the footage. Karen had crossed into dangerous territory. This wasn't just harassment anymore, it was a coordinated effort to intimidate him, possibly even to damage his property. He immediately forwarded the video to his lawyer and contacted the police again. This time, the officer on the line seemed more concerned. If they were carrying tools and materials, this could be considered preparation for vandalism, the officer said. We'll send someone to take another statement. When the police arrived, Andrew provided a detailed account of the events so far, including the mediation and Karen's increasingly aggressive behavior. He also handed over a USB drive containing all the footage from his cameras. The officers assured him that they would increase their patrols and keep an eye on Karen, but Andrew knew better than to rely entirely on them. He needed to be proactive. The next day, Andrew visited a hardware store and bought reinforced fencing materials. Though his existing fence was sturdy, it wasn't impenetrable, and he wasn't willing to leave any vulnerabilities exposed. Over the course of several grueling hours, he worked to fortify the barrier around his property, adding extra layers of protection to the weakest points. He also placed no trespassing signs at regular intervals, making it clear that any intrusion would be met with legal action. But Karen wasn't deterred. 2 days later, Andrew woke to find that one of his solar panels had been smashed. The tempered glass surface was cracked in a spiderweb pattern, and fragments littered the ground beneath it. The damage wasn't just cosmetic, the panel was now useless, its delicate internal wiring compromised beyond repair. Andrew's blood boiled as he surveyed the scene. This wasn't an accident. It was a calculated attack designed to cost him money and force him to back down. Once again, Andrew filed a police report, this time emphasizing the financial impact of the sabotage. The broken panel would cost him hundreds of dollars to replace, and the downtime in his system meant he'd have to rely on his backup generator until it was repaired. Despite the mounting stress, Andrew refused to give Karen the satisfaction of seeing him defeated. He contacted his solar contractor and arranged for an emergency replacement, sparing no expense to ensure his system was restored as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, Karen ramped up her smear campaign. Flyers began appearing in mailboxes throughout the neighborhood, accusing Andrew of being a dangerous influence and claiming that his electrical system was illegal and hazardous. The flyers were full of lies, but they struck a nerve with some of the more gullible neighbors, who began giving Andrew cold looks whenever he passed by. The isolation was palpable, and Andrew couldn't help but feel the weight of the community turning against him. One evening, as Andrew sat on his porch, trying to unwind with a glass of whiskey, he noticed a faint glow in the distance. At first, he thought it might be a neighbor's porch light or a fire pit, but as he focused, he realized it was moving, flickering erratically in a way that didn't seem natural. His heart sank as he realized what it was: a small fire, smoldering near the edge of his property. Grabbing a flashlight and a fire extinguisher, Andrew ran toward the flames, his adrenaline spiking. The fire wasn't large, but it had already spread to a dry patch of brush near the fence line. Andrew acted quickly, spraying the extinguisher over the flames until they sputtered out, leaving only a charred patch of ground behind. As he inspected the area, he found a crude fear starter, an old, half-burned rag wrapped around a piece of wood. It was another deliberate act of sabotage. The next morning, Andrew met with his lawyer and the police to discuss his options. Rachel, his lawyer, was adamant. "This has gone beyond harassment," she said. "We're dealing with criminal activity now. Between the smashed panel, the fire, and the trespassing, we have enough to file a restraining order against Karen. If she or her associates come near your property again, they'll face legal consequences." Andrew agreed, but he also knew that a restraining order might not be enough to stop Karen. She was relentless, and her influence over the neighborhood meant that she could easily find others to carry out her dirty work. Still, it was a step in the right direction, and Andrew clung to that small victory as he prepared for whatever came next. That evening, Andrew reinforced his security measures yet again. He added more cameras, installed a second layer of fencing, and even set up a motion-activated alarm near the boundary where the fire had started. He was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but he refused to give up. Karen wanted to break him, but he wasn't going to let her win. As he sat in his living room, reviewing the day's events, he felt a spark of determination reignite within him. He wasn't just defending his home, he was fighting for his peace, his safety, and his right to live without fear. And he wasn't going to stop until Karen was held accountable for her actions. Andrew's patience had reached its breaking point. The smashed solar panel, the fire near his property, and the increasingly hostile behavior of Karen and her allies had pushed him to the edge. The restraining order was filed, but Andrew knew it wouldn't magically stop Karen. People like her didn't back down when confronted, they escalated. She was too accustomed to wielding control over the neighborhood, too used to bending others to her will. But Andrew wasn't like the others. He wasn't going to let her win. The next confrontation came sooner than expected. It was late in the evening when Andrew heard the piercing shriek of his motion-activated alarm. He jumped from his chair, heart pounding, and grabbed a flashlight before heading to the back door. The floodlights on the perimeter of his property had been triggered, bathing the yard in harsh white light. He scanned the area carefully, and that's when he saw them two figures near his generator enclosure, their faces obscured by masks. One was crouched near the generator, fiddling with something, while the other stood guard, holding what looked like a metal rod. Adrenaline surged through Andrew as he turned on his megaphone, which was connected to his security system. His voice boomed across the yard, "You are trespassing on private property. Leave now, or the police will be called." The figures froze for a moment before springing into action. The one near the generator bolted toward the fence, while the other swung the metal rod into the generator housing with a loud clang. Andrew didn't wait to see what damage had been done. He grabbed his phone and dialed the police, reporting the trespassers and providing a live feed from his cameras. The response was faster than he expected. Within minutes, 2 squad cars pulled up to his property, their lights flashing. The officers fanned out, searching the area, while Andrew played back the security footage for them. Though the figures had fled, their actions were clear. One had attempted to disable his generator, while the other had deliberately caused damage before escaping. The police took his statement and promised to open an investigation, but Andrew could see the skepticism in their eyes. Without clear identification, the likelihood of catching the culprits seemed slim. The next morning, Andrew assessed the damage to his generator. The metal housing was dented, but the interior components were thankfully intact. Still, the attack was a stark reminder of how far Karen and her accomplices were willing to go. It wasn't just petty harassment anymore. They were trying to force him out of the neighborhood by making his life unbearable. Rachel, his lawyer, called that afternoon with an update. "I've spoken with the police, and they're taking this seriously now," she said. "The footage is strong evidence, and combined with the restraining order, we have enough to build a solid case against Karen. But we need to push harder. If she's coordinating these attacks, we need proof." Andrew agreed. "She's careful, though," he said. "She doesn't get her hands dirty. She sends other people to do the damage." Rachel's tone hardened. "Then we focus on her influence. If we can prove she's inciting this behavior, we can hold her accountable." That evening, Andrew reviewed his footage again, this time looking for patterns. Over the past month, the same individuals had appeared near his property multiple times, always at night, always covering their faces. He cross-referenced the footage with his neighborhood map, marking the directions from which the trespassers came and left. The paths all led back to one place, Karen's property. The next step was risky but necessary. Andrew hired a private investigator to gather more information. Within a week, the investigator uncovered a trail of evidence linking Karen to the attacks. She had been overheard at neighborhood meetings rallying others against Andrew, spreading lies about his system being dangerous, and even offering to take care of the problem herself. One neighbor, who had grown tired of Karen's antics, agreed to testify that she had seen Karen directing others to sabotage Andrew's property. Armed with this new evidence, Rachel filed an emergency injunction against Karen, citing her direct involvement in the harassment campaign. The court hearing was set for the following week, and Andrew prepared himself for what he knew would be a showdown. The day of the hearing, Karen arrived flanked by 2 of her closest allies, her usual air of smug confidence replaced by something more guarded. Andrew, accompanied by Rachel, felt a strange mix of nerves and determination as they entered the courtroom. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes, wasted no time getting to the heart of the matter. Rachel presented the evidence methodically: the security footage, the police reports, the investigators' findings, and the neighbor's testimony. Each piece built a damning case against Karen, painting her as the orchestrator of a targeted campaign to drive Andrew out of the neighborhood. Karen's lawyer attempted to deflect, claiming that the evidence was circumstantial and that Karen had no direct involvement in the attacks. But the neighbor's testimony was the nail in the coffin. "She told us he didn't belong here," the neighbor said, her voice steady. "She said his system was a threat to our safety and that we needed to make him leave. I didn't agree with what she was doing, but I was too afraid to speak up until now." Karen's face turned ashen as the words hung in the air. The judge leaned forward, her expression severe. "Ms. Jennings," she said, "the evidence against you is overwhelming. Your actions have caused significant harm to Mr. Holt, both financially and emotionally. This behavior is unacceptable." The judge granted Andrew's injunction, ordering Karen to cease all contact with him and prohibiting her from coming within 100 feet of his property. She was also fined for damages and ordered to pay Andrew's legal fees. Though it wasn't a criminal conviction, it was a decisive victory, and one that sent a clear message to Karen and anyone else who thought they could bully Andrew into submission. As Andrew left the courthouse, he felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The fight wasn't entirely over. Karen still lived in the neighborhood, and her influence wouldn't disappear overnight, but for the first time since the conflict began, he felt like he had regained control. He had stood his ground, protected his home, and shown Karen that her tactics wouldn't work. And most importantly, he had proved to himself that he could face whatever came next. In the days following the court's decision, Andrew finally began to feel the tension in his chest start to ease. Karen had been silenced, at least officially, and the restraining order provided a much-needed buffer between her and his property. Though she remained in the neighborhood, her power over it had clearly diminished. Neighbors who had once blindly followed her lead now avoided her, unwilling to be associated with her increasingly toxic reputation. Andrew noticed fewer judgmental stares when he walked to his mailbox, and even received a few polite nods from residents who had previously sided with Karen. It wasn't an apology, but it was a start. Despite the legal victory, Andrew knew he couldn't let his guard down completely. Karen might have been defeated in court, but people like her rarely admitted true defeat. Her vindictive nature would likely drive her to seek revenge in subtler ways. To stay ahead of any potential retaliation, Andrew doubled down on his security measures. He upgraded his cameras to include license plate recognition and added a second backup system to his energy setup, ensuring it could function even if the primary one was compromised. He also began documenting any suspicious activity around his property with even more diligence than before, just in case Karen decided to test the boundaries of the restraining order. One quiet morning, Andrew received an unexpected knock on his door. When he opened it, he found one of his neighbors, a man named Bill, standing on the porch with an awkward expression. Bill had been one of Karen's most vocal supporters during the early stages of the conflict, but now he seemed sheepish, almost embarrassed. "Hey, Andrew," Bill began, scratching the back of his neck. "I just wanted to say, well, I guess I owe you an apology. I didn't realize how far Karen was willing to go. She had us all convinced you were the bad guy, but after everything that's come out, I can see I was wrong." Andrew was surprised but appreciated the gesture. "Thanks, Bill," he said. "I get it. Karen's good at manipulating people. I just hope we can all move forward now." Bill nodded. "Yeah, same here. If you ever need anything, let me know. And sorry again for being part of the problem." The conversation left Andrew feeling a small sense of closure. While he didn't expect the entire neighborhood to suddenly rally behind him, Bill's apology showed that Karen's influence was waning. It was a reminder that even the most entrenched dynamics could change when people were willing to take a stand. Karen, however, remained defiant. Though she no longer had the courage to confront Andrew directly, she still cast lingering glances in his direction whenever he passed her house. Once, Andrew caught her staring out of her living room window as he worked on his solar panels. Her expression was unreadable, but her presence was a constant reminder of the trouble she had caused. Andrew refused to let her unnerve him. She might still be watching, but she no longer had the power to act. Over time, life in the neighborhood began to settle back into a routine. Andrew focused on his work and continued to make improvements to his home, ensuring it was as efficient and self-sufficient as possible. He even began to engage more with his neighbors, attending a few community events and striking up casual conversations. Though he remained cautious, he no longer felt like an outsider. The neighborhood, once Karen's domain, was slowly becoming a place where Andrew could truly feel at home. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the warm glow of his solar-powered lights illuminated the yard, Andrew sat on his porch and reflected on how far he had come. The conflict with Karen had been exhausting and at times overwhelming, but it had also taught him valuable lessons about resilience and standing up for himself. He had faced someone who thrived on control and manipulation and had emerged stronger for it. The experience had forced him to confront challenges he never expected, but it had also shown him the importance of boundaries, preparedness, and unwavering determination. As he sipped his coffee and listened to the quiet hum of his generator in the distance, Andrew allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. Karen might still live a few houses away, but she was no longer a threat. The neighborhood was no longer her kingdom, and Andrew had claimed his place in it not through intimidation or deceit, but through perseverance and the courage to fight for what was right. He had earned his peace, and he intended to keep it.